The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in February while I was up in Thunder Bay visiting my sister. I remember exactly where I was standing, in her kitchen, watching snow come down sideways off Lake Superior, a mug of tea going cold in my hand. My phone buzzed on the counter, my son-in-law's name on the screen. That was unusual enough. He never called me. We texted occasionally, the polite kind, the kind that says nothing. So when I saw his name, I picked up on the first ring. "She's at the storage facility." His voice was strange, flat and tight at the same time. "She called a locksmith. She told them she was your daughter and that she'd lost the key." I didn't say anything right away. I set down the mug. My sister was watching me from across the kitchen, and I must have had some look on my face because she stopped what she was doing. "Did they let her in?" I asked. "Not yet. The manager called me first because my number is listed as secondary contact." I let out a breath. "All right," I said. "Don't do anything. Don't call her. Don't go down there. I'll handle it." I hung up and stood there a moment with the snow against the window and my sister's eyes on me, and I thought, well, here we are. The moment I'd been waiting for, and honestly, the moment I'd been quietly dreading, had finally arrived. And the strange thing was, I wasn't angry. I'd moved past anger a long time ago. What I felt, standing there in Thunder Bay in February, was something closer to tired relief. Let me go back. My daughter. She was the one who brought him into our lives. And I want to be fair here because she is still my daughter, and I love her. But she was always drawn to a certain kind of man. The kind who talks about potential more than he talks about plans. The kind who notices what other people have and calculates quietly. She met him at a wine bar in Ottawa about 4 years ago. He was charming. He still is, if I'm honest. Broad smile, firm handshake, the kind of laugh that fills a room. He told her he was in commercial real estate. He wasn't wrong exactly. But he also wasn't senior. He was a mid-level leasing agent who drove a leased car and lived in a rented condo in Centretown. None of that would have mattered if he'd been honest about it. People start somewhere. Lord knows I started with nothing. My wife and I got married in 1987 with $1,100 between us and a 2-bedroom in Sudbury that smelled like the previous tenant's cigarettes. We built what we had slowly, carefully, over 35 years together. She passed 3 years ago, ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. And what she left behind was not just grief, but also clarity about what mattered, about what didn't, about who showed up and who calculated. He showed up at the hospital twice in those 14 months. My daughter was there every week. He came twice. I noticed my wife and I had talked about what would happen after. She was practical that way, more practical than me, and she'd been the one to first suggest restructuring how things were held. We had the house in Canada, a cottage property near Parry Sound, and some investments we'd been building since the late 90s. Nothing spectacular, but comfortable. Comfortable enough that it would look like a prize to someone who'd been quietly doing the arithmetic. We transferred the cottage into a family trust. The Canada house went into my name outright. The investment stayed in a registered account that was already structured with specific beneficiaries named. My daughter was included. The arrangement was clear and fair. What nobody outside of me and our family lawyer knew was that there was a secondary layer to the trust document, a condition. If my daughter and her husband separated within 15 years of the trust being established, her portion was to be held in trust until she reached 60, rather than paid out directly. Not to punish her, to protect her, yes, but also from the version of herself that had a history of making decisions fast and thinking slowly. My wife had insisted on that clause. I remember her lying in the hospital bed at the Civic, thinner than she should have been, and saying to me, "You know she'll let him spend it if she gets it all at once." I'd wanted to argue. I didn't, because she was right. I told our daughter about the trust in general terms. I did not tell her about the condition. The storage unit came about a year after my wife passed. I was clearing out some things from the basement. Boxes we'd had since Sudbury, files going back decades, family photographs, papers. I'd rented a unit at a facility out near the Queensway, a clean place with good security, while I sorted through everything. Some of it I'd keep. Some I'd donate. Some I hadn't been ready to look at yet. In the process of going through those boxes, I found something I hadn't expected. There was a folder my wife had kept. Not filed anywhere obvious, tucked inside a box of old Christmas cards, with printouts of emails and a handwritten note in her careful cursive. The emails were between my son-in-law and a woman I didn't recognize, spanning about 8 months. The dates were from about 2 years before my wife's diagnosis. I won't describe the contents in detail. I'll say only that they were not ambiguous and that they were thorough and that my wife had clearly known for a long time. She never told me. I've thought about why. I think she didn't want me to blow everything up while she was sick. I think she was protecting my daughter from something my daughter wasn't ready to hear. And I think she was also protecting me from the version of myself that would have handled it badly. There was a note at the bottom of the folder in her handwriting: "Don't act fast, think first." I sat with that folder in my lap in the storage unit for a long time. Then I put it back in the box. I sealed the box. I added a padlock to the storage unit that required a code I'd never shared with anyone, and I waited. I kept the secret for almost 2 years. I watched my son-in-law at family dinners, watched him pour wine and tell stories about properties he was working on, watched him hug my daughter in the kitchen. I watched my daughter look at him the way she always had, with that particular kind of hope that is almost the same as not looking clearly. I watched and I said nothing, because my wife had said think first, and because the moment I acted would be the moment everything changed, and I needed to be certain that when it changed, my daughter would land somewhere safe. I talked to our family lawyer again. I had the trust document reviewed. I added one specific note to my own will with instructions about the folder's location and its relevance to any future proceedings. Everything was documented. Everything was in order. And then I waited some more. The marriage had been difficult for the last year or so, though my daughter hadn't said much directly. I could tell by the way she called me more often and by the things she talked about or didn't talk about. She mentioned once that they'd argued about money. She mentioned once that he'd been distracted. She said it the way people say things when they want you to understand without having to explain. I didn't push. I'd learned that from my wife, too. You cannot steer someone through a door they haven't found yet. You can only make sure the landing is soft when they finally walk through it. Then came the storage facility call. I found out later how she'd found out about it. She'd seen the monthly storage invoice come through on a shared account. This was something I hadn't thought to remove her from, my one oversight, and I've given myself a hard time about that. She'd looked up the facility. She'd apparently been there once before, tried to access it with a story about being my daughter, and the manager on duty that day had actually let her take a look at the access log before catching himself and turning her away. She'd gone home knowing the unit existed and knowing I was the only one with the code. So she'd called a locksmith. What she didn't know was that the locksmith company she'd called happened to be the same company the storage facility used for their own maintenance contracts. The locksmith who took her call recognized the address and, "This is just luck, I'll admit it. Some of it is just luck," called the facility manager to confirm before proceeding. The manager called my son-in-law. My son-in-law called me. I phoned the facility manager from my sister's kitchen in Thunder Bay. I gave him my account code to verify my identity. I told him not to allow any access without my physical presence or a written court order. He agreed. He also mentioned carefully that the woman who'd called had identified herself as my daughter and that he'd need to be cautious about documenting the incident in case things went any further legally. I thanked him. I said that would be wise. Then I called my family lawyer. "I want to be clear about something. My son-in-law's call to me was not an act of loyalty or goodness. I don't believe he called me because he wanted to help me. I believe he called me because he'd realized, somewhere in the previous few months, that the financial picture wasn't what he'd assumed it was. My daughter had started asking questions about the trust, about the cottage, about what exactly she was going to inherit and when and in what form. And I believe he'd started to understand that the answers were more complicated than he'd thought. He called me because he was uncertain. He was, in a way, hedging. That's fine. I've never required people to have pure motives. I only require that their actions land in a useful place. I drove back to Ottawa the next morning. My sister offered to come with me and I told her no. This was something I needed to handle quietly. She gave me one of those looks she's been giving me since we were children, the look that says you're going to do what you're going to do. And I just hope you know what you're doing. I told her I did. My daughter was at the house when I arrived. Not my house, her and her husband's condo on Gilmore Street. I hadn't called ahead. I rang the buzzer and she let me up. She opened the door and we stood in the hallway for a moment without either of us saying anything. She looked tired. She looked like someone who'd spent a night in the particular exhaustion of being found out. "Dad," she said, "can I come in?" She stepped back and I walked into the condo. It was a nice place. They'd done it up well. Good furniture, good light. The kind of home that costs more than it looks. Her husband wasn't there. I sat down at the kitchen table. She stayed standing for a while, then sat across from me. "How did you know?" she asked. "Someone called me," I said. "Does it matter?" She shook her head. Then she said, "I thought there was something in there. Something you were keeping from me." "There is," I said. She looked at me. "And I'm going to tell you what it is," I said. "But I need you to understand something first. What I'm going to tell you isn't going to be easy to hear. And when I'm done telling you, you're going to have a decision to make. And I am not going to make that decision for you." I took the folder out of my bag. I'd retrieved it the day before from the storage unit, before coming to her. I placed it on the table between us. She looked at it. She didn't touch it yet. "Your mother found those," I said. "Before she was sick. She kept them. She left me a note telling me to think before I did anything." She reached out and opened the folder slowly. She was quiet for a long time. I watched her face. I watched the moment she understood what she was reading. I watched her read the dates. She closed the folder. She put both hands flat on the table, the way she used to do as a girl when she was trying very hard not to cry. "She knew," she said. "It wasn't really a question." "She knew," I said. "And she didn't tell me. She didn't tell either of us. She left it for after." My daughter sat with that for a while. Outside the condo windows, the Ottawa winter was doing what Ottawa winter does, gray and relentless and cold. I let her sit. I didn't fill the silence. After a while, she said, "How long have you known?" "About 2 years," she looked up. "I needed to make sure you'd be protected first," I said, "before any of this came out. I needed the trust to be solid. The cottage, your long-term accounts. I needed all of it to be somewhere he couldn't touch it, so that when this moment came, you'd have somewhere to land." She was quiet again. "That's what was in the storage unit?" she asked. "Just the folder?" "The folder," I said. "And your mother's winter coat. And some Christmas ornaments from when you were little. And a box of letters she wrote me when we were first together and I was working up north for a summer." I wasn't ready to deal with all of that yet. Something shifted in her face. The tension in it, the bracing for more, it changed into something softer and sadder and more real. "Oh, Dad," she said. We sat there together in her kitchen for another hour. She asked some questions. I answered the ones I could. The financial structure I explained clearly. The trust, the cottage, the beneficiary designations. She'd been protected. That had been the whole point. She asked me what she should do. I told her I couldn't answer that. I told her that her mother hadn't made this decision for her by finding the folder, and I wasn't going to make it for her by explaining it. What I could tell her was that she was not alone, that whatever she decided, I was not going anywhere. She nodded. She was quiet. Then she said, "Did he know about the trust structure?" "I think he suspected it wasn't as straightforward as he hoped." "Is that why he called you?" I looked at my daughter. She is not a naive woman. She never was. She just loved people in a way that sometimes got ahead of her judgment. "That's a question only he can answer," I said. She nodded again slowly. "I think I already know." Her husband moved out 6 weeks later. He didn't make it loud. I'll give him that much. He took his things and he went to stay somewhere, and the condo eventually got listed and sold. He tried, through a lawyer, to make a claim on some of the shared investments they'd held jointly during the marriage. Our lawyer handled it. The process was not pleasant, but it was not as long as it could have been. The trust held. The cottage stayed in the family. My daughter moved into a rental in Westboro while she sorted herself out. She called me most Sunday evenings. We talked about ordinary things, what she'd been cooking, a show she'd been watching, whether I was keeping the Kanata house warm enough in March. Sometimes we talked about her mother. Sometimes we didn't need to. One Sunday evening she said to me, "You know what I keep thinking about?" I said no. "I keep thinking about the Christmas ornaments," she said. "The ones in the box. You said you had them in there." "I do," I said. "Still haven't gone through them." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Can I come with you when you're ready?" I told her yes. Of course yes. We went on a Saturday in April. The storage facility was quiet, and the light that comes through those fluorescent fixtures is not particularly flattering to anything. But we sat on the floor of that unit for almost 3 hours going through the boxes. We put some things aside to keep. We put some things aside for donating. She wore her mother's winter coat for about 20 minutes because she wanted to, and neither of us said anything about it. We came to the box of letters. The ones her mother had written me in the summer of 1986, when I was up working at a paper mill outside of Hearst, and we were young and broke, and certain about very little except each other. My daughter looked at me. "Can I read them someday?" "Someday," I said. "Not yet." She understood. She put the box aside carefully. On the drive back, she said, "She was smarter than both of us." I told her she probably was. She laughed a little, the first real laugh I'd heard from her in months. It sounded like her mother's laugh enough to ache, and I was glad to hear it all the same. There is a particular kind of love that does not announce itself. It doesn't make speeches at the dinner table, or send flowers, or post anything anywhere. It files documents quietly with a family lawyer. It keeps a folder inside a box of Christmas cards. It writes a note in careful cursive that says, "Don't act fast, think first," and trusts that the person who finds it will understand. My wife and I were married for 33 years. She was the one who knew how to see around corners. She was the one who planned for the things we hoped would never happen. She saw what was coming long before I did. She made sure, in the only way she could from where she was, that our daughter would be all right. She saw him for what he was. She protected what mattered. And in the end, the folder in the box in the storage unit on the Queensway wasn't a weapon, and it wasn't a trap. It was a mother looking out for her daughter from the only distance she could manage. That was the only thing in that storage unit that was ever worth anything.